The moment Jessica's fingernails dug into my forearms, leaving angry red crescents that would turn purple by morning, I knew our relationship had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Standing in her pristine granite kitchen, surrounded by the luxury I'd helped pay for, watching my daughter-in-law's face contort with rage because I dared to question her spending habits, something inside me finally snapped. Not the dramatic kind of snap you see in movies, but the quiet, decisive kind that happens when a woman realizes she's been a fool for far too long. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone calls me Maggie, and at 62 years old, I thought I'd learned all there was to know about family dynamics. I was wrong. After 35 years of teaching third grade at Riverside Elementary, I'd seen every kind of parent, every type of family dysfunction, every manipulation tactic a child could devise. I prided myself on being able to read people, on understanding the delicate balance between helping and enabling. Yet somehow, when it came to my own family, I'd become blind to what should have been obvious warning signs. I retired 3 years ago with a modest but comfortable pension, finally free to enjoy the fruits of decades spent shaping young minds and nurturing other people's children. My husband Robert had passed away 8 years earlier from a sudden heart attack, leaving me alone in our small ranch house on Maple Street, the same house where we'd raised our only child, David. The loss had been devastating, but I'd rebuilt my life piece by piece, finding purpose in my garden, my book club, and most importantly, in being the best grandmother I could be to Tyler and Chloe. When David married Jessica 5 years ago, I was cautiously optimistic. She was beautiful, certainly, with her perfectly highlighted blonde hair and her yoga instructor figure that she maintained with religious dedication. She had a way of lighting up a room when she walked in, all bright smiles and animated gestures. David was completely smitten, and I wanted to be happy for him. I really did. But there were things about Jessica that made me uncomfortable from the beginning, though I convinced myself I was just being an overprotective mother-in-law. The request started small and seemed reasonable enough. David's salary as a marketing manager at a mid-sized firm was decent, but Jessica's part-time yoga classes at the local studio barely brought in enough to cover her expensive leggings, let alone contribute significantly to household expenses. When Tyler started having trouble in school, struggling with reading and math in ways that reminded me painfully of my own learning difficulties as a child, Jessica insisted he needed to be in private school with specialized tutoring support. Public school just isn't equipped for children with learning differences, she'd explained over dinner one evening, her manicured hand resting possessively on David's arm. Tyler needs small class sizes, individual attention, the kind of education that will set him up for success. We can't compromise on our children's futures. She was right, of course. As an educator, I knew the value of specialized instruction for children who learned differently. When David hesitantly mentioned the tuition costs, explaining that they'd looked into Jefferson Academy, the most prestigious private school in our area, I didn't hesitate to offer help. $2,000 a month seemed like a small price to pay for my grandson's educational future. I had the pension income, no major expenses beyond my modest lifestyle, and what good was money if I couldn't use it to help my family? What I didn't anticipate was how quickly those helpful contributions would expand and multiply. Within 6 months, I wasn't just paying Tyler's tuition. I was covering Chloe's preschool fees at the same academy because it wouldn't be fair to separate the siblings. I was helping with their mortgage payments when David's company went through a rough patch and his commission checks were smaller than expected. I was funding Jessica's endless wellness retreats and certification courses because investing in her career would eventually benefit the whole family. Every request came with perfectly reasonable explanations, and Jessica's ability to make me feel like the solution was not only logical, but necessary was remarkable. She had a gift for presenting problems in ways that made me feel guilty for even considering saying no. When I suggested they might want to budget more carefully or consider less expensive alternatives, Jessica would get that wounded look in her eyes and remind me how hard they were both working to provide the best life possible for my grandchildren. "Maggie, I know you want what's best for Tyler and Chloe," she'd say, her voice taking on that particular tone that managed to be both sweet and condescending at the same time. "We're not asking for handouts. We're asking for investment in their futures. David works so hard, but we both know that in today's economy, sometimes even working hard isn't enough. We're so grateful to have you in our corner." And I was in their corner, completely and utterly. When they decided to renovate their kitchen to increase the home's value, I helped with the down payment for the contractor. When Jessica's car needed major repairs that would cost more than it was worth, I co-signed for a new lease on a BMW SUV because safety is paramount when you're driving precious cargo. When they wanted to take the children on an educational trip to Disney World, I covered the expenses because creating family memories is priceless. Each time, I told myself this was what grandmothers did. This was how I could show my love and support for my son's family. Robert would have wanted me to help them achieve their dreams, to give our grandchildren every advantage possible. The pension checks kept coming, and while my own savings account grew smaller, watching Tyler and Chloe thrive in their beautiful home, attending excellent schools, participating in enriching activities, filled me with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since retiring from teaching. But somewhere along the way, the requests had stopped feeling like requests. They'd become expectations, assumptions, entitlements. Jessica no longer asked if I could help with something. She informed me of what needed to be paid and when. The gratitude that had once accompanied every conversation gradually disappeared, replaced by a casual presumption that my money was simply another household resource to be allocated as needed. The shift was so gradual that I almost didn't notice it happening. Jessica stopped calling to chat about the children or ask about my week. Our conversations became purely transactional, focused on upcoming expenses and financial needs. When I'd try to bring up other topics, to connect on a personal level, she'd respond with polite but distant acknowledgments before steering the conversation back to whatever immediate concern required my financial attention. David, caught in the middle, seemed oblivious to the change in dynamics. When I'd gently suggest that maybe they could handle some expenses on their own, he'd get defensive and remind me that Jessica was doing her best to balance work and family, that the children's needs had to come first, that they weren't asking for anything unreasonable. He'd inherited his father's conflict-avoidant nature, and it was easier for him to encourage my continued support than to have difficult conversations with his wife about budgeting and priorities. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late October. I'd been invited for dinner, something that happened less and less frequently as our relationship became increasingly centered around financial arrangements rather than family connection. Jessica had prepared one of her elaborate organic meals, the kind that cost more than I typically spent on groceries in a week, and the conversation over dinner had been pleasant enough. Tyler had excitedly told me about his progress in reading, how the specialized tutoring was finally helping him decode words that had previously seemed impossible. Chloe had shown me a painting she'd made in her art class, a colorful explosion of creativity that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with teaching young children in the first place. David had shared news about a potential promotion at work, and for a brief moment, I felt like we were functioning as a normal, loving family. After dinner, while David was helping the children with their homework upstairs, Jessica and I were cleaning up in the kitchen. She was loading the dishwasher with characteristic efficiency when she casually mentioned that Tyler's tutor had recommended additional specialized testing that wasn't covered by insurance. "It's only about $3,000, she said, not looking up from the dishes. But Dr. Martinez thinks it could identify some underlying processing issues that might explain why Tyler's still struggling with certain concepts. Obviously, we want to do everything possible to help him succeed." I paused in wiping down the counters, feeling a familiar knot forming in my stomach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. $3,000 on top of the $2,000 monthly tuition, the mortgage help, the car payment assistance, the endless stream of emergency expenses that had become routine. I'd been reviewing my bank statements earlier that week, trying to understand why my own financial cushion had dwindled so dramatically, and the reality of how much I'd been contributing to their household had been sobering. "Jessica," I said carefully, "maybe this is something you and David should save up for over the next few months. I've been helping quite a bit lately, and I'm starting to worry about my own financial security." She straightened up slowly, her perfectly manicured hands still gripping a serving bowl. When she turned to face me, her expression had transformed completely. Gone was the sweet, grateful daughter-in-law who'd been chatting pleasantly just moments before. In her place stood a woman whose blue eyes had turned cold and calculating. "Your financial security?" she repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Maggie, you live in a house that's been paid off for 20 years. You have a pension that covers all your expenses and then some. We're talking about your grandson's education, his future, and you're worried about your financial security?" I felt heat rising in my cheeks, partly from embarrassment and partly from a growing anger I wasn't used to experiencing. "I'm not saying I won't help. I'm just suggesting that maybe we should plan for these expenses instead of treating them as emergencies. $3,000 is a significant amount of money." Jessica set the bowl down with more force than necessary, the sound echoing sharply in the granite and stainless steel space. "A significant amount of money for what exactly? For ensuring that your grandson gets the help he needs? For making sure he doesn't struggle academically the way his father did?" The comment about David stung, partly because there was truth in it. David had struggled in school, had fought his way through college with determination but not ease. I'd always wondered if he might have had undiagnosed learning differences, if earlier intervention might have made his academic journey smoother. Jessica knew exactly which buttons to push. "That's not fair," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I've supported Tyler's education from the beginning. I've supported this entire family. I'm just asking for some consideration of my own needs occasionally." "Your needs?" Jessica's laugh was sharp and bitter. "What needs exactly? You sit in that house all day reading books and tending your little garden. You have no expenses, no responsibilities, no real purpose except to be available when your family actually needs you. And now, when we're asking for help with something that could change Tyler's entire academic trajectory, you want to talk about your needs?" The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage. I stared at her, seeing clearly for the first time the woman my son had married. Not the charming, enthusiastic person she presented to the world, but someone calculating and manipulative. Someone who viewed me not as family, but as a resource to be managed and exploited. "Jessica, that's incredibly hurtful," I managed to say. "I've given everything I can to help this family. I've never once complained or made you feel guilty about asking for help. All I'm suggesting is that maybe we could plan ahead for expenses like this instead of expecting me to write a check every time something comes up." Her face flushed red, and I could see her struggling to maintain the composure that usually served her so well in these conversations. "Plan ahead? With what? Money, Maggie? Do you think we're living some kind of extravagant lifestyle? Every penny David makes goes to basic living expenses. The house payment, insurance, groceries, utilities, the children's activities. We're not buying luxury cars or taking expensive vacations. We're trying to provide a stable, nurturing environment for our children, and sometimes that requires help from family members who are in a position to provide it." "I understand that," I said, my own voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "But I'm not an endless source of funding. I'm a retired teacher on a fixed income, and I need to think about my own future too." What happens if I need medical care or have to move to assisted living someday? What happens if there's an emergency in my life? That's when Jessica's mask finally slipped completely. Her face contorted with rage, and she stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell her expensive perfume mixed with the wine she'd had with dinner. Are you seriously going to stand there and guilt trip me about hypothetical future problems when your grandson needs help right now? She hissed. After everything we've done to include you in this family, after all the dinners and holidays, and special occasions where we've made sure you felt welcome, you're going to choose money over family? I felt trapped against the kitchen counter, intimidated by her proximity and the fury radiating from her. This was a side of Jessica I'd never seen before, and I realized with growing alarm that I was seeing the real person behind the carefully constructed facade. I'm not choosing money over family, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm asking for understanding and respect. I'm asking to be treated like a person with her own needs and limitations, not just a bank account. Understanding and respect? Jessica's voice dripped with contempt. You want to talk about respect? Let me tell you about respect, Maggie. Respect is understanding that when your child needs help, you provide it without making the parents feel like they're begging. Respect is recognizing that David works incredibly hard to support this family, and that sometimes even hard work isn't enough in today's economy. Respect is being grateful that you have the opportunity to make a real difference in your grandchildren's lives instead of sitting around feeling sorry for yourself. Each word was like a slap, designed to make me feel small and selfish and wrong for even questioning the financial arrangements that had taken over our relationship. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, partly from hurt and partly from a rage I'd never experienced before. This woman had systematically isolated me from my son, had turned family gatherings into opportunities to present new financial needs, had reduced our entire relationship to a series of transactions, and now she was making me feel guilty for finally pushing back. You're being cruel, I whispered, my voice shaking. I've given everything I could to help this family, and you're making me feel like it's never enough. Maybe because it's not enough, Jessica shot back. Maybe because being a grandmother means more than writing checks when it's convenient for you. Maybe because Tyler needs this testing now, not in 6 months when you've finished feeling sorry for yourself about your precious savings account. I felt something breaking inside me, some fundamental shift in how I saw this woman and this situation. Jessica, I think we should end this conversation before we both say things we'll regret. But she wasn't finished. Her face was flushed with wine and anger, and she stepped even closer, backing me further against the counter. Oh, we're going to finish this conversation right now. You're going to write that check for Tyler's testing, and you're going to stop making us feel guilty every time we need help. David and I are working our asses off to build a good life for these children, and the last thing we need is guilt trips from someone whose biggest worry is whether she can afford her book club membership. Stop it, I said, my voice stronger now. You're being completely unreasonable. I'm not your personal ATM, and I won't be spoken to this way in any house, even if I helped pay for it. That's when she grabbed me. Her manicured fingers dug into my forearms with surprising strength, her nails biting through the thin fabric of my cardigan and into the soft skin beneath. I gasped in pain and shock, staring down at her hands gripping my arms like claws. "Don't you dare," she hissed, her face inches from mine. "Don't you dare throw your financial help in my face like some kind of weapon. You offered that help. Nobody forced you to pay for anything. And if you think you can use it to control us or make demands, you're more delusional than I thought." I tried to pull away, but her grip tightened, her nails digging deeper. I could feel them breaking the skin, could feel the sharp pain of flesh being torn. "Jessica, you're hurting me. Let go." For a moment she held on, her blue eyes blazing with a fury that scared me more than the physical pain. Then, As if suddenly realizing what she was doing, she released me abruptly, stepping back with the expression of shock that might have been genuine or might have been another performance. I looked down at my arms, seeing the angry red marks her nails had left, some of them already beginning to bleed slightly. In the morning, I knew they would be dark purple bruises, lasting evidence of this moment when our relationship had crossed into something ugly and irreversible. Maggie, Jessica started, but I held up a trembling hand to stop her. Don't, I said quietly. Don't you dare apologize or try to explain this away. You just physically assaulted me because I questioned your spending, because I suggested that maybe, just maybe, I have the right to consider my own financial security. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how to minimize what had just happened, how to spin it into something less serious than it actually was. But there was no spinning away the evidence on my arms, no explaining away the moment when she'd crossed the line from emotional manipulation to physical violence. I gathered my purse with as much dignity as I could muster, my hands shaking as I tried to process what had just occurred. I'm leaving now. Tell David I'll talk to him tomorrow. Maggie, wait, Jessica called after me, her voice taking on that sweet, pleading tone she used when she wanted something. You're overreacting. I barely touched you. We were just having a heated discussion about Tyler's needs, and emotions got a little out of hand. These things happen in families. I turned back to look at her one last time, seeing clearly now what I should have recognized years ago. No, Jessica. These things don't happen in healthy families. Healthy families don't physically assault each other over money. And they don't treat their relatives like personal banks with no feelings or needs of their own. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Riverside, my arms throbbing with each movement of the steering wheel, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Absolute clarity. The fog of guilt and obligation that had clouded my judgment for so long had lifted, leaving me with a crystal clear view of exactly what had been happening in my relationship with my son's family. I wasn't a beloved grandmother whose generosity was appreciated. I was a resource to be managed, manipulated, and when necessary, intimidated into compliance. The beautiful life I'd been helping to fund, the private schools and luxury cars and gourmet meals had all been built on my willingness to prioritize their wants over my own needs. And when I'd finally, tentatively suggested that maybe I deserved some consideration too, I'd been physically attacked. That night, I sat in my small, quiet kitchen, staring at the bruises forming on my arms and making a decision that would change everything. I opened my laptop and logged into my online banking, looking at the automatic transfers I'd set up to help with various monthly expenses. $2,000 for Tyler's tuition, $500 for their mortgage shortfall, $300 for Chloe's preschool, miscellaneous transfers for car payments, insurance supplements, and emergency expenses that had become routine. With steady fingers and a calm heart, I canceled every single automatic transfer. Then I drafted an email to my financial advisor, requesting a meeting to discuss moving my assets into accounts that would better protect my own retirement security. For the first time in 3 years, I was going to put my own financial well-being first. The marks on my arms would fade in a week or two, but the marks I was about to leave on their bank statement would last much longer, and they would send a message that even Jessica, with all her manipulation skills, couldn't misinterpret. I was done being anyone's victim. I spent the weekend nursing my bruised arms and wounded pride, applying ice packs and concealer in equal measure. The physical marks were healing, but the emotional damage ran much deeper. Every time I caught sight of the purple fingerprints on my forearms, I felt a mixture of shame and rage that surprised me with its intensity. How had I allowed things to deteriorate to this point? How had I become so blind to what was clearly an abusive dynamic? Linda, my neighbor and closest friend since Robert's death, noticed immediately when I met her for our usual Monday morning coffee at the little cafe downtown. She'd been my colleague at Riverside Elementary for 15 years before I retired, and she knew me well enough to recognize when something was seriously wrong. "Maggie, honey, what happened to your arms?" she asked, reaching across the small table to gently touch the fading bruises that my long sleeves hadn't quite concealed. I'd rehearsed several explanations during my sleepless weekend, ranging from a minor fall in my garden to a clumsy encounter with a cabinet door. But looking into Linda's concerned brown eyes, I found myself telling the truth. The whole ugly, humiliating truth about Jessica's attack, about the years of financial manipulation, about my gradual transformation from beloved grandmother into personal ATM. Linda listened without interruption, her expression growing more horrified with each detail I shared. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, shaking her silver head in disbelief. "That woman put her hands on you," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Over money. Money that you've been freely giving them for years. Maggie, this isn't just about family drama or boundary issues. This is assault." Hearing the word spoken aloud sent a chill through me. Assault. Such a serious, legal-sounding term for what had felt, in the moment, like a family argument that had gotten out of hand. But Linda was right. Jessica had physically hurt me because I'd dared to question her financial demands. That wasn't normal family conflict. That was violence. "I keep thinking I must have done something wrong," I admitted, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug for warmth. "Maybe I was too harsh, too selfish. She's under a lot of stress with the children and David's work situation." "Stop it right there," Linda said firmly. "There is no excuse for what she did to you. None. Stress doesn't justify putting your hands on someone, especially an elderly family member who's been nothing but generous and supportive. You're making excuses for her behavior, and that's exactly what she's counting on." The conversation with Linda forced me to confront some uncomfortable truths about my situation. Over the past 3 years, I'd gradually isolated myself from friends and activities, always making myself available for whatever crisis or need arose in David's household. I'd declined invitations to travel with Linda and other retired teachers because I might be needed for emergency babysitting. I'd skipped book club meetings when they conflicted with school events for Tyler and Chloe. I'd even turned down a part-time consulting opportunity with the school district because Jessica had convinced me that my time was better spent being available for family responsibilities. Without realizing it, I'd allowed my entire identity to become wrapped up in being useful to David's family. When had I stopped? Being Margaret Thompson, retired educator with her own interests and dreams, and become simply Grandma Maggie, the reliable source of emotional and financial support? When had my own needs and desires become so secondary that even suggesting they might matter was grounds for physical assault? That Monday evening, David called. I'd been expecting to hear from him all weekend, assuming that Jessica would have. Told him about our confrontation and the ugly way it had ended. But when I answered the phone, his voice was casual and cheerful, asking about my weekend and mentioning that Tyler had finally mastered a particularly challenging reading passage. "Jessica mentioned you stopped by for dinner Thursday night," he said, and I could hear him moving around what I assumed was their kitchen. "She said you seemed a little stressed about something. Everything okay, Mom?" I held the phone away from my ear for a moment, staring at it in disbelief. Stressed. About something. That was how Jessica had characterized her assault on me. Not as an argument about financial boundaries, not as a moment when she'd lost control and physically hurt me, but as me being stressed about something unspecified and presumably minor. "David," I said carefully, "did Jessica tell you what we discussed during dinner?" "Not really," he replied, and I could hear the sound of a refrigerator opening. "She just said you'd been talking about Tyler's tutoring and that you seemed overwhelmed. I told her you've been doing so much for us lately. Maybe we should give you a break from some of the kid activities for a while. The casual dismissal of what had been, for me, a traumatic and relationship-altering event was almost as shocking as the attack itself. Jessica had managed to spin the entire incident into a story where I was the one with the problem, the one who was overwhelmed and needed accommodation, rather than the victim of her violent outburst. "Did she mention that she hurt me?" I asked directly, abandoning any attempt at subtle probing. There was a pause, longer than I'd expected. "Hurt? You how?" David asked, his voice suddenly more focused. "She grabbed my arms hard enough to leave bruises when I suggested that maybe you and she should save up for Tyler's additional testing instead of expecting me to write another check immediately." The silence stretched on so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, David spoke, his voice careful and measured. "Mom, I'm sure there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Jessica would never intentionally hurt anyone, especially you. Maybe emotions were running high, and there was some kind of accident." An accident. My son was already making excuses for his wife's behavior, already finding ways to minimize and rationalize what she'd done. I realized with growing dismay that this wasn't going to be the conversation I'd hoped for, where David would be appalled by his wife's actions and take steps to address the situation. Instead, I was going to have to convince my own son that his wife had assaulted me, and he was already predisposed to dismiss my account in favor of whatever story Jessica had told him. "It wasn't an accident, David," I said firmly. "She was angry that I questioned the constant financial requests, and she grabbed my arms hard enough to leave marks. She was trying to intimidate me into writing that check for Tyler's testing." Another long pause. "Look, Mom, I know Jessica can be intense sometimes. She's really passionate about the kids' education and their future. Maybe she got a little carried away in the conversation, but I'm sure she didn't mean to hurt you. Why don't I talk to her about being more mindful of how she communicates?" More mindful of how she communicates. As if the problem was her tone of voice, rather than her willingness to use physical force to get what she wanted. I felt a deep sadness settling over me as I realized that my son was going to choose his wife's version of events over mine, that he was going to minimize and excuse her behavior, rather than confront the reality of what had happened. "David, I need you to understand something," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "What happened Thursday night wasn't a communication problem. It was assault. Your wife put her hands on me in anger because I dared to suggest that I have financial limitations. That's not normal behavior, and it's not something that can be fixed with better communication." "Mom, you're being really dramatic about this," David replied, and I could hear the irritation creeping into his voice. "I know Jessica, and she's not violent. She's never hurt anyone in her life. Maybe you misinterpreted something she did, or maybe she was trying to emphasize a point and accidentally used more force than she intended. But calling it assault seems really extreme." The word dramatic hit me like a physical blow. My own son was dismissing my experience, gaslighting me into questioning my own perception of events. This was exactly what Jessica had been counting on when she'd crafted her version of the story. She'd known that David would believe her over me, that he'd find ways to excuse and minimize her behavior, that he'd make me the problem rather than address her actions. "I'm not being dramatic," I said quietly. "I'm being honest about what happened. And the fact that you're more concerned about defending Jessica than about the fact that she hurt me tells me everything I need to know about where your loyalties lie." "That's not fair," David protested. "Of course I care about you. But I also know my wife, and what you're describing just doesn't sound like something she would do. Maybe we should all sit down together and talk this through like adults." The suggestion of a mediated conversation between me and the woman who'd assaulted me was so absurd that I almost laughed. David was treating this like a minor family disagreement that could be resolved with better communication, completely missing the fundamental shift that had occurred in my relationship with his family. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said. I think I need some time and space to process what happened and decide how I want to move forward. Move forward with what? David asked, confusion evident in his voice. Mom, you're talking like this is some kind of major crisis. It was a misunderstanding that got a little heated. These things happen in families. We can work through this. But I was beginning to understand that David and I had very different definitions of family. To him, family meant that I should absorb whatever treatment Jessica chose to dish out, that I should continue funding their lifestyle regardless of how they treated me, that my role was to give and support and never expect anything in return except the privilege of being included in their lives. To me, family meant mutual respect, consideration, and care. It meant that even in moments of disagreement or stress, you didn't physically assault each other. It meant that financial help was appreciated rather than expected, and that the person providing that help was treated with gratitude rather than entitlement. After I hung up with David, I sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by the photos and mementos of our family's happier times. Pictures of David's graduation from college, his wedding day, the births of Tyler and Chloe. Evidence of a relationship that had once been built on love and mutual respect, before it had been corrupted by money and manipulation. I thought about the conversation I'd just had with my son, about his immediate impulse to protect and excuse his wife rather than support and believe his mother. I thought about Jessica's calculated cruelty, her willingness to use physical force to maintain control over the family's financial arrangements. And I thought about my own culpability in creating this dynamic, my own willingness to prioritize their needs over my own well-being for so long that they'd come to see it as their right rather than my choice. The next morning, I had my meeting with my financial advisor, a competent woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been managing my retirement accounts since Robert's death. I explained the situation in broad terms, focusing on my need to protect my assets for my own future security rather than continuing to fund my son's family's lifestyle. Sarah was professional and non-judgmental as she reviewed my accounts and the pattern of withdrawals I'd been making to support David's household. She didn't comment on the obvious drain on my resources, but I could see her doing calculations in her head as she pulled up my statements. Mrs. Thompson, she said carefully, based on what you've been contributing to your son's family over the past 3 years, you've significantly reduced your long-term financial security. If you continue at this rate, you'll exhaust your savings within about 7 years, leaving you entirely dependent on your pension income. The stark reality of my situation, laid out in numbers and projections, was sobering. I'd been so focused on helping David's family achieve their immediate goals that I'd ignored the long-term consequences for my own financial stability. I was potentially putting my own future at risk to fund their present comfort. What would you recommend? I asked. First, I'd suggest we move your assets into accounts that are less liquid, making it harder for you to access large amounts quickly for non-emergency purposes. Second, I'd recommend establishing a strict monthly budget for any family assistance you choose to provide, treating it like any other fixed expense rather than an open-ended commitment. Third, I think you should seriously consider whether continued financial support at this level is sustainable or advisable. Sarah's professional. Assessment confirmed what I'd been reluctantly concluding since Thursday night's confrontation. My financial relationship with David's family wasn't just emotionally unhealthy, it was potentially catastrophic for my own future security. I was putting myself at risk to fund a lifestyle that they couldn't afford on their own, and they'd shown no appreciation for that sacrifice. Worse, they'd shown they were willing to use manipulation and even physical force to maintain access to my resources. That afternoon, I made several more difficult phone calls. I canceled the automatic transfer for Tyler's tuition, explaining to the school's billing office that there had been a change in the payment arrangement and that David would need to handle the account going forward. I canceled the supplemental, payments for their mortgage, their car expenses, and all the other monthly contributions that had become routine parts of my budget. Each call was harder than the last, not because of any practical difficulty, but because I was systematically dismantling the structure that had defined my relationship with my son's family for the past 3 years. I was choosing my own financial security over their comfort, my own well-being over their expectations, and I knew that when they discovered what I'd done, there would be consequences. The first angry call came Wednesday evening. Jessica's voice was tight with barely controlled fury as she informed me that Tyler's tuition payment had been declined and that the school was threatening to remove him from the program if the account wasn't brought current immediately. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," she said, dispensing with any pretense of politeness, "but this affects innocent children. Tyler doesn't deserve to be punished because you're having some kind of senior moment about family responsibilities." Senior moment. The casual ageism in her dismissal of my decision was almost amusing in its transparency. I was too old and confused to make rational decisions about my own money, too addled to understand the importance of maintaining their financial arrangements. It was another manipulation tactic, designed to make me doubt my own judgment and rush to fix the problem she was presenting. "I've decided to discontinue the monthly financial support," I said calmly. "You and David will need to make your own arrangements for Tyler's tuition and your other expenses." "You can't just stop without warning," Jessica protested, her voice rising. "We have contracts, commitments, obligations based on your support. You can't just pull the rug out from under us because you're upset about some minor disagreement." Minor disagreement. She was still characterizing her assault on me as a minor disagreement, still refusing to acknowledge the severity of what she'd done. I felt my resolve strengthening with each word she spoke. "The financial support was always voluntary," I reminded her. "It was never a contract or a guarantee. I'm simply choosing to allocate my resources differently." "Allocate your resources differently," she repeated mockingly. "What resources, Maggie? What are you possibly going to spend that money on? You have no life, no interests, no purposes beyond this family. Without us, you're just a lonely old woman with nothing to do but count her money." The cruelty of her words was breathtaking, but they no longer had the power to wound me the way they once would have. Instead, they served as confirmation that I was making the right choice. This was who Jessica really was when she wasn't getting what she wanted. Vindictive, manipulative, and willing to say anything to maintain control. "Perhaps you're right," I said mildly. "Perhaps I am just a lonely old woman with nothing better to do than count my money. But it's my money to count, and I'm choosing to keep it." The conversation deteriorated from there, with Jessica cycling through anger, threats, guilt trips, and finally desperate pleading. She promised that things would be different, that she'd be more respectful, that they'd find ways to reduce their dependence on my support. But her promises rang hollow because they were motivated entirely by the loss of my financial contributions, rather than any genuine recognition of how she'd treated me. When David called later that evening, his approach was different, but equally ineffective. He tried to frame the situation as a temporary misunderstanding that could be resolved with compromise and better communication. He suggested that maybe I could continue with Tyler's tuition while they worked on becoming more financially independent in other areas. He reminded me of how much the children would suffer if they had to leave their schools and adjust to public education. But I'd heard all these arguments before, and I'd seen how quickly expressions of gratitude and promises of change had evaporated once the immediate crisis was resolved. The pattern was clear. They would say whatever they needed to, say to restore their access to my money, but nothing fundamental would change about how they viewed me or treated me. "I understand this is difficult," I told David, "but my decision is final. I won't be providing financial support going forward." "Mom, please be reasonable," he pleaded. "I know Jessica handled things badly the other night. She feels terrible about it. But don't punish the children because of one argument between adults." The suggestion that I was punishing Tyler and Chloe rather than protecting myself was perhaps the most manipulative argument yet. My grandchildren would be fine. They would attend different schools, participate in fewer expensive activities, and live in a smaller house, but they would be loved and cared for. Framing my decision as punishment of innocent children was designed to trigger my protective instincts and override my rational assessment of the situation. The children aren't being punished, I said firmly. They're simply going to learn to live within their parents' actual means instead of depending on their grandmother's subsidies. It might be good for all of you to experience some financial independence. By the end of that week, I'd received dozens of calls and texts from both David and Jessica. The messages ran the gamut from angry accusations to heartbreaking pleas, to cold threats about limiting my access to the grandchildren. Each communication reinforced my growing understanding that my relationship with this family had been fundamentally transactional, built on my willingness to provide financial support rather than any genuine affection or respect for me as a person. The threats about the grandchildren were particularly revealing. The implication was clear. My access to Tyler and Chloe was contingent on my continued financial contributions. If I stopped funding their lifestyle, I would be cut off from the children I loved. It was emotional blackmail of the most calculated sort, designed to force me back into compliance with their financial expectations. But something had shifted in me since that night in their kitchen, since the moment Jessica's nails had dug into my arms. I was no longer willing to be held hostage by threats and manipulation. I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own security and dignity for the privilege of being used by people who clearly didn't value me beyond my bank account. Linda was proud of me when I told her about the steps I'd taken to protect my finances and establish boundaries with David's family. She'd been worried about my financial situation for months, watching me drain my savings to fund what she saw as an unsustainable and unhealthy dynamic. "I know this is hard," she said as we sat in my garden, enjoying the last warm days before winter set in. "But you're doing the right thing. You raised David to be independent and self-sufficient. It's time for him to live up to that training." Her support meant everything to me during those difficult weeks. When I doubted my decision, when the guilt and loneliness threatened to overwhelm me, Linda reminded me of my worth as a person beyond my utility as a financial resource. "I should have been outraged on your behalf. I should have demanded that Jessica apologize and get help for her anger management issues. Instead, I protected her at your expense, and I'm deeply ashamed of that." The conversation continued for over an hour, with David seeming to take genuine responsibility for the dysfunction in our family dynamics. He acknowledged that the financial arrangements had become unhealthy and unsustainable. He admitted that Jessica had developed an entitled attitude toward my contributions. He even conceded that my decision to establish boundaries had been not only reasonable, but necessary. "The thing is, Mom," he said as our conversation began to wind down, "I think this crisis might actually be good for us in the long run. It's forced me to take a hard look at how we've been living, how dependent we've become on your support, how that dependency was affecting our relationship with you." I felt my guard beginning to lower, despite my best efforts to maintain skepticism. This David, reflective and accountable, reminded me of the thoughtful young man I'd raised, the son who had once written me heartfelt letters from college thanking me for my sacrifices and promising to make me proud. "Jessica and I have been talking," he continued, "and we both realize we need to make some major changes. We're looking into refinancing the house to lower our monthly payments. Jessica is going to increase her hours at the yoga studio and maybe pick up some private clients. We're researching public school options for the kids that might actually be better fits for their learning styles anyway." Each proposed change sounded reasonable and mature, evidence that they were finally taking responsibility for their own financial situation rather than relying on my subsidies. I found myself imagining a future where we could have a healthy relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial dependency. What about Tyler's tutoring? I asked. The specialized help he needs for his learning difficulties? We've found a graduate student in education who can work with him for a fraction of what we were paying the private center, David explained. She's actually really excited about his case and thinks she can help him develop better strategies for managing his challenges. It might end up being more beneficial than the expensive program we had him in. Everything he was saying made sense. More than that, it suggested that my decision to cut off financial support had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped, forcing them to become resourceful and self-sufficient, helping them realize they could manage their own lives without depending on my constant bailouts. I'm proud of you for taking these steps, I said, and I meant it. It sounds like you're building a more sustainable approach to your family's finances. David smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. We are, and Mom, I want you to know that none of this changes how much we love you and want you in our lives. The kids ask about you constantly. Tyler keeps wondering why Grandma doesn't come to his soccer games anymore, and Chloe drew you a picture that she wants to give you. The mention of my grandchildren hit me like a physical blow. I'd been trying not to think about them too much, knowing that dwelling on what I was missing would only make my resolve waver. But hearing that they were asking about me, that they missed me, made my chest ache with longing. I miss them too, I admitted, more than I can express. Then let's fix this, David said, leaning forward with renewed energy. Let's figure out a way to move forward that works for everyone. I know it'll take time to rebuild trust, but I think we can do it if we're all committed to being honest and respectful with each other. The conversation ended with tentative plans for me to attend Tyler's soccer game the following Saturday. David assured me that Jessica was genuinely remorseful about her behavior and eager to apologize in person. He painted a picture of a family, ready to change, ready to value me for who I was rather than what I could provide, ready to build the kind of healthy relationships I'd been longing for. As I watched him drive away, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Maybe my stand had worked. Maybe the pain and isolation of the past month had been worth it if it resulted in genuine change and a healthier dynamic going forward. Maybe I could have both my boundaries and my family. The soccer game was held at the sprawling athletic complex where Tyler's team practiced twice a week. I arrived early, wanting to secure a good spot on the bleachers and mentally prepare for what would be my first face-to-face encounter with Jessica since the night she'd assaulted me. The November morning was bright and cold, perfect weather for youth soccer, and the sidelines were crowded with parents bundled in coats and scarves, holding steaming cups of coffee and cheering enthusiastically for their children. I spotted Jessica immediately standing near the team bench in her expensive athleisure wear, her blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. When she saw me approaching, her face lit up with what appeared to be genuine pleasure and relief. She actually jogged over to meet me, her arms outstretched as if for a hug, her expression radiating warmth and contrition. "Maggie!" she exclaimed, and before I could react, she'd enveloped me in an embrace that felt surprisingly sincere. "I'm so glad you came. I've missed you so much, and I've been desperate to talk to you." I stiffened slightly in her arms, my body remembering the last time she'd put her hands on me, but I tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. David had said she was remorseful, and her greeting certainly seemed to support that claim. "Hello, Jessica," I said when she released me, keeping my voice neutral but not unfriendly. "Can we talk for a minute before the game starts?" she asked, gesturing toward a quieter area near the parking lot. "I have so much I need to say to you." We walked away from the crowd of other parents, finding a spot near the concession stand where we could speak privately. Jessica's demeanor was subdued and serious, her usual bright confidence replaced by what appeared to be genuine humility. "Maggie, I owe you the most sincere apology," she began, her blue eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "What I did that night in our kitchen was inexcusable. There's no justification for putting my hands on you, regardless of how emotional or stressed I was feeling. I've been horrified by my own behavior ever since it happened." The apology was everything I'd hoped to hear from her. It was direct. It took full responsibility without making excuses, and it acknowledged the severity of what she'd done. I felt some of the tension I'd been carrying begin to ease. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied. "It was very frightening and hurtful." She helped me remember who I'd been before I'd allowed my entire identity to become wrapped up in being useful to David's family. But even with Linda's support, the isolation was painful. David and Jessica stopped calling after that first week, and my attempts to reach out and suggest supervised visits with the grandchildren were met with cold responses about needing time to process my betrayal of the family. I was being punished for setting boundaries, frozen out until I agreed to resume my role as their personal bank. The silence from their household was deafening, but it was also revealing. If my relationship with Tyler and Chloe had been based on genuine love and connection, it wouldn't have evaporated the moment I stopped writing checks. The fact that my access to my grandchildren disappeared along with my financial contributions proved that Jessica had been right about one thing. The relationship had been entirely transactional. As October turned to November, I found myself facing a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could capitulate to their demands, resume the financial support, and return to my role as the family ATM in exchange for limited, conditional access to my son and grandchildren. Or I could maintain my boundaries, accept the loss of those relationships, and build a new life based on my own needs and interests, rather than my utility to others. The decision, when it came, surprised me with its clarity. I was done being anyone's victim, done sacrificing my own well-being for people who saw me as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. I was 62 years old, in good health, with potentially decades of life ahead of me. I could spend those years being useful to ungrateful family members, or I could spend them discovering who Margaret Thompson really was when she wasn't defined entirely by her willingness to give everything to others. For the first time in 3 years, I was going to choose myself. The November air was crisp with the promise of winter when I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my kitchen, preparing a simple lunch and actually enjoying the peaceful solitude that had become my new normal when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw David standing on my front porch, holding a small bouquet of flowers from the grocery store and looking genuinely contrite. My heart did a small flip at the sight of him. Despite everything that had happened, despite the painful conversations and the clear evidence that he would choose Jessica over me every time, he was still my son. The little boy I'd raised alone after Robert's death. The young man I'd been so proud to see graduate from college and build a successful career. The father of my grandchildren, whom I missed desperately despite the toxic circumstances that had driven us apart. I opened the door cautiously, not inviting him in immediately. "David, this is unexpected." He shifted uncomfortably on the porch, the flowers looking small and inadequate in his large hands. "Hi, Mom. I was hoping we could talk. Really talk. Not like those phone conversations we've been having." There was something different about his demeanor. Gone was the defensive anger that had characterized our recent interactions, replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse and vulnerability. Against my better judgment, I found myself stepping aside to let him enter. "I brought these for you," he said, offering the flowers with a hesitant smile. "I know they're not much, but I remembered you always liked chrysanthemums." The small gesture of remembering my favorite flowers touched me more than it should have. It had been so long since anyone in his family had paid attention to my preferences, or tried to please me in any way that wasn't connected to financial gain. I accepted the bouquet and went to find a vase, using the activity to compose myself and prepare for whatever conversation was coming. "Coffee?" I offered, falling back, on the habits of hospitality that had been ingrained in me since childhood. "That would be great," David said, settling into one of the kitchen chairs where he'd sat for countless meals during his childhood and adolescence. For a moment, The years fell away, and I could almost pretend we were just mother and son having a normal visit. As I prepared the coffee, David began talking in a way that caught me off guard with its apparent sincerity. "Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking these past few weeks. About our family, about how things have changed, about the way we've been treating you." I kept my back to him as I measured coffee grounds, not trusting myself to maintain composure if I had to look at his face while he spoke. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "I think I've been blind to a lot of things," he said quietly. "I've been so focused on providing for my family, on making sure Tyler and Chloe have every advantage, that I lost sight of how my decisions were affecting you. And I think Jessica and I both got so comfortable with your help that we started taking it for granted." The admission was more than I'd expected, and I felt a dangerous flutter of hope in my chest. This was what I'd been longing to hear from him: acknowledgement that there had been problems, recognition that I'd been treated poorly, some indication that he understood why I'd felt compelled to establish boundaries. I turned to face him, studying his expression for signs of manipulation or insincerity. But his brown eyes, so much like his father's, seemed genuinely troubled, and his posture radiated the kind of discomfort that came from confronting uncomfortable truths about oneself. "I'm glad you can see that," I said carefully, setting his coffee cup in front of him and taking the seat across the small table. "It's been very painful to feel like I was valued only for what I could provide financially." David nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "I know, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner, and I'm especially sorry for the way I responded when you tried to tell me about what happened with Jessica that night." My breath caught. This was the first time he'd acknowledged that something significant had occurred during that confrontation, the first time he'd moved beyond characterizing it as a minor misunderstanding or communication problem. "What do you think happened that night?" I asked, needing to understand how much clarity he'd actually gained about his wife's behavior. David was quiet for a long moment, staring down into his coffee. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "I think Jessica lost her temper and hurt you, physically hurt you. And instead of being horrified by that and demanding she apologize, I made excuses for her because it was easier than dealing with the reality of what she'd done." The admission was so much more than I'd expected that I felt tears spring to my eyes. Finally, my son was acknowledging the truth of what had happened, recognizing that his wife had crossed a serious line, admitting that his response had been inadequate and hurtful. "It was very painful to have my own son dismiss my experience," I said softly. "To be told I was being dramatic when I was trying to tell you that your wife had assaulted me." "I know," David said, and there were tears in his eyes too. "I failed you as a son." "I know," Jessica said, reaching out as if to touch my arm, then stopping herself. "I keep thinking about how scared and betrayed you must have felt, and it makes me sick. You've been nothing but generous and supportive to our family, and I repaid that kindness with violence. It's unforgivable." Her recognition of the impact her actions had on me felt validating in a way I hadn't expected. For weeks, I'd been questioning my own reaction, wondering if I'd been too sensitive or dramatic. Hearing Jessica acknowledge that my feelings had been justified helped quiet some of the self-doubt that had been plaguing me. "David told me you've been making some changes," I said. "Taking steps toward financial independence." Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "We have. This whole situation has been a wake-up call for both of us. We realized how unhealthy our relationship with money had become, how much pressure we'd been putting on you without even realizing it. We're committed to living within our actual means from now on." She went on to detail the same changes David had mentioned, but with additional specifics that made them sound even more promising. She'd already picked up 3 new private yoga clients and was in talks with a local gym about teaching classes. They'd met with a financial advisor who'd helped them create a realistic budget. They'd even started researching family activities that were free or low cost, recognizing that their children needed experiences and memories more than expensive possessions. "The most important thing," Jessica said, her voice growing emotional, "is that we want you back in our lives. Not as a financial safety net, but as Tyler and Chloe's grandmother, as David's mother, as part of our family. We've all learned how much we took your presence for granted, and we're committed to showing you the respect and appreciation you deserve." As if summoned by her words, Tyler came running over from where the team was warming up, his face lighting up when he saw me. "Grandma, you came to my game!" He threw his small arms around my waist, and I felt my heart melt completely. This was why I'd been willing to endure so much pain and conflict. Not for David or Jessica, but for these precious children who loved me simply and completely. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I told him, ruffling his dark hair. "Are you ready to show me all those soccer skills you've been practicing?" "I've gotten so much better at passing," Tyler said excitedly. "And guess what? I don't need the special tutoring anymore. Mom found me a new teacher who's really nice, and she comes to our house and she said I'm actually really smart. I just think about things differently than other kids." The joy and confidence in his voice brought tears to my eyes. Maybe the changes they'd made really were beneficial for everyone. Maybe Tyler was thriving in ways that the expensive private programs hadn't allowed. Maybe this crisis had indeed been the catalyst for positive transformation. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said. "I can't wait to hear all about your new teacher." The soccer game was delightful. Tyler played with enthusiasm and skill, and I found myself cheering alongside the other grandparents and parents, feeling like I belonged in this community of people who cared about these children. Jessica was attentive and friendly throughout the game, including me in conversations with other parents and making sure I felt comfortable and welcome. During halftime, she brought me a hot chocolate from the concession stand and sat beside me on the bleachers. "I hope you know how much this means to Tyler," she said softly. "He's been asking about you constantly, wondering why you stopped coming to his games and activities." I felt terrible knowing it was because of my behavior. The acknowledgement of responsibility continued to impress me. This Jessica seemed genuinely transformed, humble and accountable in ways I'd never seen before. I began to think that maybe people really could change. That maybe the shock of losing my support had forced her to confront aspects of herself she'd previously ignored. After the game, which Tyler's team won in a nail-biting finish, Jessica invited me to join them for lunch at a casual family restaurant nearby. "Nothing fancy," she assured me. "Just pizza and the chance for the kids to spend more time with you." The lunch was wonderful. Chloe, who had seemed shy and uncertain when she first saw me, gradually warmed up and was soon chattering about her preschool friends and her favorite books. Tyler regaled me with stories about school and soccer and his new tutor, his earlier struggles with learning seemingly forgotten in his excitement about his recent progress. David arrived halfway through the meal, having finished up some work commitments, and his face lit up when he saw our family gathered around the table like old times. "This is perfect," he said, sliding into the booth beside Jessica. "This is exactly what I've been hoping for." The conversation over lunch continued to reinforce my growing optimism about our family's future. David and Jessica talked openly about their financial restructuring, acknowledging mistakes they'd made, and expressing genuine gratitude for the wake-up call that had forced them to take responsibility for their own lives. "We've actually discovered we're more capable than we thought," Jessica said, stealing a piece of pepperoni from Tyler's pizza slice. "I was so used to having the safety net of your support that I never pushed myself to find creative solutions to our challenges. Now that we're managing everything ourselves, I feel more confident and empowered." David nodded in agreement. "It's been good for our marriage too. We're working together as a team instead of relying on external help. We're communicating better about money and priorities. In some ways, this crisis was exactly what we needed." As the lunch wound down and we prepared to leave, Jessica pulled me aside for a private moment. "Maggie, I want you to know that this isn't just about getting back in your good graces," she said earnestly. "The changes we're making are permanent. We're building a sustainable life that doesn't depend on anyone else's financial support. And we're committed to treating you with the love and respect you've always deserved." I hugged her goodbye, feeling more hopeful about our relationship than I had in months. Maybe my stand had worked. Maybe the pain of the past month had been worth it if it resulted in genuine change and healthier dynamics. That evening, I called Linda to tell her about the day, expecting her to share my optimism about the apparent transformation in David's family. But her response was more cautious than I'd anticipated. "I'm glad they're saying all the right things," she said carefully. "But, Maggie, you need to be very careful here. People who are genuinely committed to change usually don't transform this quickly or completely. What you're describing sounds almost too good to be true." Her skepticism deflated some of my euphoria, but I tried to maintain my positive outlook. "Maybe they were ready for change and just needed the right catalyst," I suggested. "Maybe losing my support forced them to confront problems they'd been ignoring." "Maybe," Linda agreed, but her tone remained dubious. "Just promise me you'll take things slowly. Don't rush back into old patterns just because they're being nice to you right now. Real change takes time to prove itself." Over the next 2 weeks, my relationship with David's family seemed to continue improving. I was invited to Tyler's school play, where he had a small speaking role that he performed with adorable seriousness. Jessica made a point of introducing me to other parents as Tyler's wonderful grandmother, including me in conversations and making me feel valued and appreciated. I attended Chloe's preschool Thanksgiving pageant, where she played a very enthusiastic turkey, complete with feather, costume, and gobbling sound effects. David took photos of the three of us together afterward, promising to frame one for my house and one for theirs. The invitations and inclusion felt genuine, and I began to relax into the possibility that we really had turned a corner. Maybe Linda's caution had been unnecessarily pessimistic. Maybe people really could change when faced with the right motivation. The first crack in the facade appeared during Thanksgiving week, though I almost missed its significance at the time. I was at their house for a pre-holiday dinner, helping Jessica with food preparation while David played with the children in the living room. The atmosphere was warm and domestic, exactly the kind of family scene I'd been longing for. As I was chopping vegetables for the stuffing, Jessica's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and stepped away to take the call, speaking in low tones that I couldn't quite make out. When she returned to the kitchen, her expression was slightly troubled, though she tried to hide it. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Oh, just some billing confusion," she said with a dismissive wave. "Nothing important." But something about her demeanor had shifted, a tension that hadn't been there before the call. She seemed distracted for the rest of the evening, her responses to conversation slightly delayed. Her usual animated energy dampened. I didn't think much of it at the time, attributing her mood change to the normal stress of holiday preparation. But looking back, I realized that phone call was probably the first sign that their financial restructuring wasn't going as smoothly as they'd claimed. The second warning sign came the following week, when I stopped by unannounced to drop off some books I'd picked up for the children. Jessica answered the door in workout clothes, but instead of inviting me in as had become her recent custom, she stepped onto the porch and partially closed the door behind her. "I'm so sorry, but this isn't a great time," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "David's on an important work call, and the kids are both napping. Maybe we could plan something for later in the week." The explanation was reasonable, but something felt off about the interaction. Jessica seemed nervous, almost furtive, and I caught a glimpse of papers scattered across their dining room table before she'd blocked my view. Financial documents, perhaps, or bills that contradicted their claims of successful budget management. But I pushed aside my concerns, not wanting To return to the suspicious mindset that had characterized our relationship for so long. Maybe I was being paranoid, reading problems into innocent situations because I'd been conditioned to expect manipulation and deceit. The truth revealed itself in a way that was both shocking and sadly predictable. I was having coffee with Linda at our usual spot downtown when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the name of Jefferson Academy, Tyler's private school, and I answered with mild curiosity, wondering why they would be calling me directly. "Ms. Thompson?" The voice on the other end was crisp and professional. "This is Patricia Wells, the billing coordinator at Jefferson Academy. I'm calling because we've had some confusion about Tyler Thompson's account, and I was hoping you could help clarify the situation." My stomach dropped instantly. "What kind of confusion?" "Well, we show that you were previously responsible for monthly tuition payments, but those stopped in October. However, we received a call this morning from Jessica Thompson indicating that there had been a banking error and that you would be resuming payment responsibility. She provided what she claimed was your authorization to charge the past due balance to a credit card, but our policy requires direct confirmation from the payment source." The words hit me like a physical blow. Jessica had called the school and claimed I would be resuming Tyler's tuition payments. She'd apparently provided some form of authorization, possibly even a credit card number, and tried to fraudulently charge me for the back balance that had accumulated since I'd stopped paying. "I have not authorized any payments," I said firmly, my voice shaking with rage and betrayal. "In fact, I specifically informed your office in October that I would no longer be responsible for this account. David and Jessica Thompson are Tyler's parents, and they are solely responsible for his tuition." There was a pause, then a more cautious tone from the billing coordinator. "I see. So the information Mrs. Thompson provided was incorrect?" "It wasn't just incorrect," I said, my anger building with each word. "It was fraudulent. She attempted to make unauthorized charges to my credit card account." After I hung up with the school, I sat in the cafe trying to process what had just happened. All the apologies, all the promises of change, all the warm, family moments of the past month had been an elaborate performance designed to lower my guard and restore their access to my money. Jessica had been planning this fraud for weeks, probably since our first conversation at Tyler's soccer game. The realization of how thoroughly I'd been manipulated was nauseating. Every hug, every family dinner, every inclusion in school events had been calculated moves in a longer game designed to make me trust them again so they could resume their financial exploitation. The Jessica who had seemed so transformed, so humble and accountable, had been an act as skillful as any Oscar-winning performance. Linda took one look at my face and immediately understood that something terrible had happened. "What is it?" she asked, reaching across the table to take my hand. I told her about the call from the school, about Jessica's attempt to fraudulently charge my credit card, about the elaborate deception they'd been orchestrating for the past month. With each word, I felt more foolish for having believed their claims of transformation, more angry at myself for being so easily manipulated. "I'm such an idiot," I said, tears of rage and humiliation streaming down my face. I wanted so badly to believe they had changed that I ignored every instinct telling me it was too good to be true. "You're not an idiot," Linda said firmly. "You're a loving mother and grandmother who wanted to believe the best about your family. There's nothing wrong with hoping for change. The problem is with people who exploit that hope for their own gain." That evening, I called my credit card company to alert them about the potential fraud attempt and to ensure that no unauthorized charges could be processed. Then I sat down to compose what I knew would be my final communication with David and Jessica, a letter that would make my position absolutely clear and close the door on any future attempts at manipulation. As I wrote, I felt a strange sense of relief washing over me. The month of false hope had been more painful than the initial betrayal, because it had forced me to experience the loss of my family twice. Now, with their true nature revealed beyond any possibility of doubt, I could finally let go completely. I could stop hoping for change that would never come and start building a life that didn't depend on their approval or inclusion. The marks Jessica had left on my arms had faded weeks ago, but the marks I was about to leave on their expectations would be permanent and final. The letter I wrote that night was unlike anything I'd ever composed in my 62 years of life. Every word was chosen with surgical precision, designed to cut through the layers of manipulation and deceit that had characterized my relationship with David and Jessica for far too long. I wrote it by hand on my good stationery, the weight of the paper lending gravity to the finality of my message. "David and Jessica," I began, my handwriting steady despite the tremor of rage that ran through my entire body. "The attempted credit card fraud perpetrated by Jessica today has revealed the true nature of your recent reconciliation efforts. What I initially perceived as genuine remorse and meaningful change was, in fact, an elaborate deception designed to restore your access to my financial resources." I paused in my writing, staring out the window at the November darkness, still hardly able to believe the depth of their betrayal. The month of warm family dinners, of Jessica's apparent transformation, of David's heartfelt apologies, had all been theater. Every hug, every inclusion in family activities, every expression of gratitude and respect had been carefully orchestrated manipulation designed to make me vulnerable to exactly this kind of financial exploitation. "Your willingness to commit fraud," I continued writing, "demonstrates a level of entitlement and disrespect that goes far beyond anything I previously imagined. You have shown me that you view me not as a person deserving of honesty and dignity, but as a resource to be manipulated and exploited through whatever means necessary." The words flowed onto the paper with surprising ease, as if some dam had finally burst inside me, releasing years of suppressed frustration and hurt. I wrote about the pattern of escalating demands, about Jessica's physical assault, about David's immediate rush to defend and excuse his wife's violence. I wrote about their calculated use of my grandchildren as emotional leverage, their threats to limit my access to Tyler and Chloe whenever I dared to assert my own needs or boundaries. "I am no longer willing to participate in this dynamic," I wrote. "I will not subject myself to further manipulation, fraud attempts, or abuse. I will not allow my love for my grandchildren to be weaponized against me. I will not sacrifice my own security and dignity for people who have repeatedly demonstrated that they view me as nothing more than a bank account with emotions." The most difficult part of the letter was the section about Tyler and Chloe. My heart ached as I wrote about my love for them, my hopes for their futures, my regret that their parents' choices had made it impossible for me to maintain a healthy relationship with them. But I also wrote about my refusal to model for them that love meant accepting abuse, that family loyalty required sacrificing one's own well-being, that grandmothers existed solely to fund other people's dreams at the expense of their own security. "I hope someday," I wrote through tears that blurred my vision, "when Tyler and Chloe are adults capable of forming their own relationships independent of their parents' manipulation, we might reconnect. Until then, I am choosing myself, my peace, and my financial security over the privilege of being used by people who have shown me nothing but disrespect and contempt." I ended the letter with a clear statement that any future contact attempts would be considered harassment, that I had documented their fraud attempt with appropriate authorities, and that I would be taking legal action if they made any further attempts to access my financial accounts or credit cards. I signed it simply Margaret Thompson, rather than Mom or Grandma, a small but significant assertion of my identity beyond my relationships to them. The next morning, I drove to their house and left the letter in their mailbox, along with a manila envelope containing photocopies of all the financial records documenting my years of support. I wanted them to see in black and white exactly how much I'd contributed to their lifestyle, exactly how much they'd taken from me while treating me with such casual disrespect. As I drove away from their neighborhood for what I knew would be the last time, I felt a profound sense of liberation. The beautiful colonial house that I'd helped them afford, the manicured lawn and expensive landscaping that my money had partially funded, the luxury cars in the driveway that bore my financial fingerprints, all of it receded in my rearview mirror like remnants of someone else's life. The response came faster than I'd expected. By that afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly, with calls from both David and Jessica, their voicemails escalating from confused hurt to angry accusations to desperate pleading. I listened to each message once, then deleted it without responding. Their words had lost all power to affect me. Empty manipulations from people whose true nature I now understood completely. David's messages followed a predictable pattern. First came denial that Jessica had attempted any fraud, followed by suggestions that there had been some kind of misunderstanding with the school's billing department. Then came minimization, claims that even if Jessica had made some kind of error, it wasn't malicious, just a miscommunication born of desperation and stress. Finally came the guilt trips, reminders of family bonds and obligations, threats about my relationship with the grandchildren, emotional manipulation designed to make me question my own perceptions and cave to their demands. Jessica's messages were more revealing in their raw desperation. Gone was the humble, transformed woman who had charmed me back into their lives. In her place was someone frantic and furious, someone whose carefully constructed facade had crumbled, completely under the pressure of having her fraud attempt exposed. "You're destroying this family over a simple mistake," she said in one voicemail, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Tyler is going to have to leave his school because of your vindictiveness. Chloe is asking why Grandma doesn't love her anymore. You're punishing innocent children because you're too selfish and petty to forgive one moment of poor judgment." In another message, she tried a different approach, her tone shifting to wounded vulnerability. "Maggie, I don't understand how you can throw away years of family relationships over money. I thought you loved us. I thought we meant more to you than your bank account. I guess I was wrong about the kind of person you really are." The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and might have worked on the woman I'd been just months earlier. But that woman, the one who had prioritized everyone else's needs over her own well-being, who had absorbed abuse and exploitation in the name of family loyalty, who had allowed her entire identity to become wrapped up in being useful to ungrateful people, was gone. In her place was someone harder, clearer, more protective of her own interests. Someone who recognized manipulation when she heard it, who understood that love without respect was just exploitation wearing a prettier mask. Someone who had learned, painfully but definitively, that some relationships were too toxic to salvage, no matter how much history they shared, or how much you wanted them to work. Linda was proud of me when I told her about the letter and my decision to cut contact completely. "It takes incredible strength to walk away from family," she said as we sat in my garden, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall from the maple tree that Robert had planted when David was born. "Most people keep hoping and trying long past the point where it's healthy or wise." I kept thinking they would change, I admitted. I kept believing that underneath all the manipulation and entitlement, there were people who genuinely cared about me. It took attempted fraud for me to finally accept that I was wrong. "Some people are incapable of genuine love," Linda said gently. "They can mimic it, perform it, use it as a tool to get what they want, but they can't actually feel it. And once you accept that reality, it becomes easier to protect yourself from their manipulations." In the weeks that followed, I began the process of rebuilding my life from the ground up. For 3 years, my entire existence had revolved around being available for David's family, being useful to their endless needs and crises. Now, for the first time since Robert's death, I was free to discover who Margaret Thompson really was, when she wasn't defined by her relationships to other people. I started small, with activities that felt manageable and non-threatening. I rejoined the book club I'd abandoned when family obligations became too demanding. I signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd been interested in for years, but never had time to pursue. I began volunteering at the literacy program at the public library, using my teaching skills to help adult learners improve their reading abilities. Each new activity felt like a small act of rebellion against the woman I'd been, the one who had believed her only value lay in what she could provide to others. I was discovering interests and talents I'd forgotten I possessed, meeting people who valued my company rather than my bank account, building a life that was entirely my own. The financial relief was significant and immediate. Without the constant drain of supporting David's family, my pension income was more than adequate for my modest lifestyle. I was able to rebuild my emergency fund, contribute properly to my retirement accounts, and even begin planning for some of the travel I'd dreamed about during my teaching years, but never felt free to pursue. Sarah, my financial advisor, was amazed by the transformation in my financial picture. "It's remarkable how quickly your situation has stabilized," she said during our December meeting. "Without those monthly outflows, you're actually in excellent shape for long-term security. You could maintain your current lifestyle indefinitely, and even afford some luxuries you've been denying yourself." The word luxuries felt foreign to me after years of viewing any spending on myself as selfish when David's family had so many needs. But gradually, I began to allow myself small indulgences. I bought books without checking the library first. I upgraded my cable package to include premium movie channels. I hired a housekeeping service to come twice a month, freeing up time for more enjoyable activities. Most significantly, I began planning a trip to Europe that I'd dreamed about since my college days. England, Ireland, and Scotland, countries whose literature and history had fascinated me throughout my teaching career, but which had always seemed too expensive and self-indulgent to actually visit. Now, with my finances stabilized and my time entirely my own, the trip felt not just possible but essential, a celebration of my newfound freedom and self-determination. The first Christmas without David's family was difficult, but not in the way I'd expected. Rather than feeling lonely or regretful, I felt peaceful. Linda invited me to spend Christmas Eve with her family, and I accepted gratefully, enjoying the warmth of relationships built on mutual affection rather than obligation or manipulation. Christmas Day, I spent quietly at home, reading, cooking, a simple meal for myself, and reflecting on how dramatically my life had changed in the space of just 2 months. There were moments of sadness, particularly when I thought about Tyler and Chloe, when I wondered what they were told about my absence from their lives. But even those moments of grief were tinged with relief. I was modeling for them, even in my absence, that adults had the right to set boundaries, that love didn't require accepting abuse, that sometimes walking away was the healthiest choice for everyone involved. January brought unexpected validation of my decision in the form of a call from Sarah, my financial advisor. She'd been contacted by someone claiming to represent David, asking about my accounts and whether there were any mechanisms for family members to access my funds in case of emergency. "I told them absolutely not," Sarah said, her voice tight with indignation. "Your accounts are protected and private. The fact that they would even ask suggests they're still looking for ways to access your money. I'm glad you've been so careful about protecting your assets." The attempted probe into my financial accounts confirmed what I'd suspected. David and Jessica hadn't given up on finding ways to exploit me financially. They were still viewing me as a resource to be accessed rather than a person to be respected. Their recent silence hadn't indicated acceptance of my boundaries, but rather a strategic retreat while they looked for new angles of attack. I thanked Sarah and asked her to document the inquiry, adding it to the growing file of evidence that supported my decision to cut contact with my son's family. Each new manipulation attempt, each boundary violation, each effort to find ways around my explicit refusal to provide further support proved that I'd been right to walk away when I did. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility that I hadn't felt in years. My garden, neglected during The years when I'd been too busy managing family crises to tend it properly responded to my renewed attention with enthusiastic growth. I spent hours planting new flowers, vegetables, and herbs, finding deep satisfaction in nurturing something that would grow and flourish under my care without demanding more than I was freely willing to give. The Europe trip I'd planned for May was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. Traveling solo for the first time in decades, I discovered a confidence and independence I'd forgotten I possessed. I wandered through the British Museum, stood on the cliffs of Moher, explored Edinburgh Castle, and felt like I was finally living the life I'd put on hold for far too long. In a small bookshop in the Cotswolds, I met Eleanor, a retired professor from Cambridge who was also traveling alone. We struck up a conversation about the novels of Jane Austen, and before I knew it, we'd spent the entire afternoon exploring the village together, sharing stories about our lives and travels. When she invited me to join her for the remainder of her trip through Scotland, I said yes without hesitation, embracing the spontaneity that my newfound freedom made possible. "You seem like someone who's recently discovered herself," Eleanor observed as we watched the sunset over Loch Lomond, glasses of wine in hand and the peaceful sound of water lapping against the shore. "There's something about your energy that suggests you've broken free from something that was constraining you." I told her about my journey, about the years of financial and emotional exploitation, about the assault that had finally opened my eyes, about the fraud attempt that had ended my illusions once and for all. Eleanor listened without judgment, nodding with understanding born of her own experiences with family members who had tried to take advantage of her generosity. Family can be the most toxic relationship in our lives precisely because we're taught that blood should excuse any behavior, she said thoughtfully. We're conditioned to believe that we owe endless forgiveness and support to relatives, regardless of how they treat us. It takes tremendous courage to reject that conditioning and choose yourself. The conversation with Eleanor crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't yet articulated. I wasn't just protecting myself from David and Jessica's manipulation. I was actively choosing to prioritize my own well-being and happiness. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself rather than for other people's expectations and demands. When I returned from Europe in June, I felt like a different person. The tentative, uncertain woman who had discovered her son's family's true nature just months earlier had been replaced by someone confident, purposeful, and clear about her own worth. I'd proven to myself that I could not only survive without their approval and inclusion, but actually thrive. The house felt different when I walked through the door, lighter somehow, as if the toxic energy of constantly worrying about family crises and financial demands had finally dissipated completely. I unpacked my souvenirs and photos, arranging them in places where they would remind me daily of my independence and capability. There was one final test of my resolve waiting in my mailbox. Among the bills and catalogs was a graduation announcement for Tyler, who was finishing second grade, and moving on to third. Inside the formal announcement was a handwritten note from David, the first direct communication I'd received from him since the fraud attempt. "Mom," it read, "I know things have been difficult between us, but Tyler specifically asked me to send this to you. He misses you and talks about you often. Whatever problems we've had as adults, please don't let them affect your relationship with your grandchildren. They love you and deserve to have their grandmother in their lives." The emotional manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. Tyler's innocent desire to share his achievement was being weaponized to make me feel guilty for maintaining my boundaries. The suggestion that I was somehow punishing the children by protecting myself from their parents' abuse was designed to trigger my protective instincts and override my rational assessment of the situation. I read the note twice, waiting for the familiar stab of guilt and longing that would have once sent me rushing back into their toxic embrace. Instead, I felt only a mild sadness for Tyler, who was caught in the middle of a situation created entirely by his parents' choices, and a deep gratitude for how much I'd changed in my ability to resist manipulation. I wrote a brief response on a simple card. "Congratulations to Tyler on his graduation. I wish him every success in 3rd grade." I didn't sign it "Love Grandma" or include any personal message that could be interpreted as an opening for renewed contact. I mailed it directly to Tyler at their home address, ensuring that David and Jessica would see that I was capable of acknowledging my grandson without compromising my boundaries or opening myself to further exploitation. The summer passed peacefully, filled with gardening, reading, travel with Linda and other friends, and the simple pleasure of living according to my own preferences and schedule. I'd established a routine that nourished me, relationships that respected me, and activities that brought me joy rather than stress. In August, Linda and I were having lunch at our favorite cafe when she noticed something that made her smile. "Maggie, look at yourself," she said, gesturing toward the large mirror that covered one wall of the restaurant. "Really look." I turned to see my reflection and was startled by what I saw. The woman looking back at me was relaxed, confident, with clear eyes and a genuine smile. My posture was straight and strong, my expression open and peaceful. I looked like someone who was comfortable in her own skin, someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to defend it. "You look like yourself again," Linda said softly. "Like the woman I knew before all this family drama started consuming your life. Actually, you look better than that. You look like someone who's learned something important about her own value." She was right. I did look different, and more importantly, I felt different. The constant anxiety that had characterized my relationship with David's family, the perpetual worry about their next crisis or demand, the exhausting cycle of giving and hoping for appreciation that never came, all of it was gone. In its place was something I'd never experienced before: complete peace with my own choices. I'd chosen myself over their demands, my security over their comfort, my well-being over their approval. And rather than feeling selfish or guilty about those choices, I felt proud of them. As autumn arrived again, marking nearly a year since Jessica's assault had started my journey toward independence, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed. I'd gone from being a woman defined entirely by her usefulness to others, to someone who valued herself enough to demand respectful treatment. I'd learned to recognize manipulation when I saw it, to trust my own perceptions even when others tried to gaslight me, to walk away from relationships that diminished rather than nourished me. The marks Jessica had left on my arms had faded within weeks, but the marks I'd left on their bank statement, their expectations, their ability to exploit me, those were permanent. I'd taken back my power, my resources, and my right to live on my own terms. Standing in my garden on a crisp October morning, coffee cup in hand and surrounded by the flowers I'd planted and tended with my own care, I felt a profound sense of completion. I'd survived the loss of family relationships I'd thought were essential to my happiness, and I'd discovered that my happiness didn't depend on other people's approval or inclusion. I'd learned that love without respect was worthless, that family loyalty shouldn't require self-sacrifice, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. I was 63 years old, financially secure, emotionally independent, and surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. I had travel plans, creative pursuits, meaningful volunteer work, and genuine friendships built on mutual respect and affection. Most importantly, I had something I'd never possessed during all those years of trying to earn my family's love through financial support: peace. Complete, unshakable peace with my choices, my boundaries, and my worth as a person who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The woman who had stood in that granite kitchen almost a year ago, absorbing Jessica's abuse and questioning her own right to financial security, was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more protective of her own well-being. Someone who understood that the most important relationship in her life was the one she had with herself. As I sipped my coffee and planned my day, which would include lunch with Eleanor, who had become a dear friend since our trip to Scotland, followed by volunteer tutoring at the library and dinner with Linda and her family, I felt grateful for every painful step that had brought me to this place of peace and self-respect. Jessica had left marks on my arms that night in her kitchen, marks that had faded and disappeared. But I had left marks on their expectations, their entitlement, their ability to exploit my love and generosity that would last forever. And in doing so, I had discovered something invaluable: the strength to choose myself. Even when that choice came at the cost of relationships I had once thought I couldn't live without. I could live without them. In fact, I was thriving without them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.